Welcome to On Track. I'm Aisha Jaffer. The 2025 Kentucky legislative session and the governor's veto period are officially behind us. Now that the dust has settled, what actually made it into law? What got struck down or left on the table? And what should Kentuckians be watching as we look ahead to next year? To help us sort through it all, we're joined once again by Sylvia Goodman, Capitol reporter for Kentucky Public Radio. She's been covering state politics and government since 2023, keeping Kentuckians up to date on what's happening in Frankfort. Before that, she reported for the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Public Media, and the Chronicle of Higher Education in D.C. Originally from Louisville, she's back home and has kept a close watch on what's unfolded in the legislature. Sylvia, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
So now that the session has wrapped, can you give us a quick refresher on how long lawmakers were in session this year?
Right. So this is a short year. So they only had 30 days. Now, that's like 30 days of actually meeting. So it's over several months. But they only had 30 days to conduct their business. They took a few breaks in there, including a 10-day veto period. That's for the governor to review all the legislation that they'd so far passed and decide whether or not he'd put his signature on it or if he'd actively veto it. But all in all, they had to end right around now, right before the start of April, and they only had 30 days to get everything done, and they got a lot done in those 30 days.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. Well, what do you think has defined the second half of this year's legislative session? And that's just a good general thought.
Sure. What's defined it? Really, one of the main kind of themes we've seen this year is Medicaid, I would say. We saw a lot of focus on Medicaid, and that's, we've been hearing a lot about Medicaid, both on the federal and state level. Yeah. But we saw lots of bills about how Medicaid's being spent, questions about oversight, and, a lot of changes made also this session.
Right. What are some of those changes?
So we saw several bills. Let me see. HB 495 was one bill that made some Medicaid changes. It also did a few other things, but one of the things it did is it banned Medicaid spending on gender-affirming care. So that's hormone treatments or surgeries. To our knowledge, there was no surgeries being paid for on Medicaid, no gender reassignment, gender-affirming surgeries. But there were people on hormone therapy. That's what we've been hearing. And they will no longer have access to that therapy on Medicaid if it was for gender-affirming purposes, if it was for that diagnosis. And then also, perhaps more broadly speaking, because very few people on gender-affirming care on Medicaid, but more broadly speaking, there was another bill that really at the last minute there put in place a mandatory work requirement program. That's been a topic of conversation for a long time in Kentucky and nationally. I'm sure everyone's heard about this before, but basically it requires that Governor Beshear, a Democrat who so far has not been in favor of work requirements, I don't think that's changed, would require his administration to request Trump to allow the state to put in place mandatory work requirements for people on Medicaid. So you'd have to actively prove that you are working or otherwise engaged in community if you're an able-bodied adult who doesn't have dependents in order to stay on Medicaid. So that is likely to go into effect. It also puts in place a Medicaid advisory board. They've been talking about doing that for a while. That would just basically meet sometime in the interim and they would meet and talk about how we could make Medicaid more sustainable or cheaper, frankly, for the state.
Yeah. Wow. So a lot of changes there. Mm-hmm. So like you said, you mentioned House Bill 495, and that was on conversion fit therapy and banning Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care. It was one of several bills in this session outside of the theme of Medicaid affecting LGBTQ plus Kentuckians. Yeah. How did it, you told us how it ultimately played out, but what does it signal about where state lawmakers are headed on LGBTQ plus policy?
Well, it really signaled that they're not done legislating LGBTQ plus individuals in this state and legislating in order to limit their rights or the things that the health care they can access in this state, quite honestly. So 495, like I mentioned, gender affirming care and Medicaid. We also saw Senate Bill 2, which the governor declined to sign, so he let it become law without his signature. That had to do with gender-affirming care in prisons for people incarcerated, and that banned that treatment for people incarcerated. And all of these bills, and you also mentioned that same bill that had to do with Medicaid. It also overturned Governor Beshear's executive order that banned or at least aimed to limit conversion therapy in the state for minors specifically. So they overturned that. And so really, we've seen for several years now, there's been a lot of attempts to legislate around what LGBTQ, specifically transgender individuals, can do in this state and what healthcare they can access, particularly for kids. And so this really continued that trend. And it showed that lawmakers are not done with this topic.
We also talked about how there is sort of a federal reflection. And I want to talk about House Bill 4, which bans DEI efforts at Kentucky's public universities, moved through the legislature as President Trump issued a federal order eliminating DEI programs across government. How did this bill end up, and how does it reflect the broader influence of new federal policy on Kentucky lawmakers this year?
Sure. So we saw that was House Bill 4 that you're talking about, banned a huge swath of programs in higher education under this broad umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which had a somewhat interesting definition. We can talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, it's a pretty direct reflection of what we're seeing nationally. But I do think it's worth noting that it's certainly not just because of that executive order that lawmakers are pursuing this type of legislation. Last year, we saw a really similar bill to House Bill 4 come up, and it did pass both chambers, but it didn't end up passing fully out of this because it required concurrence, and it didn't end up getting concurrence from the Senate. But a very similar bill, House Bill 4, did end up making it across the finish line after Governor Beshear did veto it, and then the both chambers overrode his veto. And that bill, it did a lot of things. Like I said, banned all officers, and initiatives that had to do with DEI. It also banned bias investigations, which have kind of been so if you think your professor has been biased against you based on your beliefs or based on your race or something like that, those investigations are now banned. It also banned, this is kind of out of the realm of higher education, banned licensure boards, which are like they license doctors and therapists, things like that, from requiring DEI trainings. It also, banned required courses so if you have a major that has a required course that includes something that they call quote unquote discriminatory concepts, which is very similar to the bill's definition of DEI, then you are not allowed to pursue that. Those majors are not allowed either. So they have to remove those required courses if they want to continue. So this has gone through, and it's something that's was it an addition sort of to the bill of last session? It did add, and it also subtracted from that bill from last session. It was a bit of more refined, seems like the wrong word, but refined version of that bill. It had a lot more, for example, exceptions to what could be allowed. Clearly the lawmakers had discussed this at length during the interim because there weren't a lot of changes at the end of the day. The bill that was introduced was very similar, if not identical. Well, it was not identical, but very similar to the one that ended up passing at the end, which is not always the case in our legislature. But yeah, so they definitely talked about this quite a bit. Like I said, last year, the reason it didn't end up going through is because the two chambers did not agree on a final version at the end of the day. This is a reflection that they have come to an agreement. And I think that there is a very good chance that part of that is the national push, that all lawmakers were able to agree, this is what we want to do because President Trump has set this agenda. Right. And so that brings me to Kentucky abortion laws. What changes have been made on Kentucky's abortion laws? Sure. So this is basically, there's a lot of question marks, I will say, about this. Any. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of question marks about that bill. That was House Bill 90. And basically the idea that lawmakers put forward is that, look, we've seen in other states and we've seen kind of around the country that there are examples of times where abortion laws have gotten in the way of women getting care in life-threatening situations. And so we are going to propose language that clarifies our existing exemption for the life of the mother, because that is a current exemption. But pro-abortion groups and doctors just around the state have said that they don't believe that that exception is strong enough, that it's not clear enough. And so lawmakers who are in favor of House Bill 90 said, this will clear it up. We saw this really late in the session. They did not propose this right away. This was added to a pretty much unrelated bill about freestanding birthing centers, which was a bipartisan issue. Right. And they added this on. And doctors are split of whether it really provides a lot of clarity. So it does clarify things like ectopic pregnancies are not included under the abortion ban, and molar pregnancies are not included under the abortion ban. However, it says things like it uses this term that it calls them not abortion, it calls them separations from the mother in order to add this clarification to the abortion ban, that if it's a life-threatening situation, it's not an abortion, it's a separation. Doctors say that actually complicates the issue more. They also say that this kind of the wording around medically necessary interventions and the standard by which doctors have to prove whether or not a abortion care was necessary or not, that standard has risen, that the wording is still equally confusing. So there's not a lot of clarity about these clarifications is basically what I'm trying to get at here.
Did it pass as well?
It did pass. It did pass over Governor Beshear's veto.
And that was something that constituents brought up, right? It sounds like that they need more clarity, but maybe this is still something that might come up next year as well.
I think it might come up as long as the abortion ban is in place. I mean, I think providers, unless there's a really ironclad, very clear, doctors will not be held liable if they believe that they're saving a woman's life, which is not currently what we have. What we have is closer to if you're in a true emergency, you can act, is
right.
Kind of what the language looks like if it's a life-threatening situation. But all these words, doctors, I don't think in many cases feel confident. They still feel like they need to talk to lawyers before they provide care. I think that we'll continue to hear about this until doctors feel confident providing care, which it's at least some pro-abortion groups say is not possible under an abortion ban.
And I know it sounds like I'm jumping around, but there's so many bills, like you said, that went through. I want to talk about Senate Bill 89, which limits the state's ability to regulate pollution in waterways that aren't federally protected. What does this debate tell us about how the legislature is approaching environmental oversight right now?
Yeah, this is such an interesting one, too, because it follows another trend we're seeing in the legislature, which is this kind of retreating to federal minimums, to the baseline that the feds require. And it's being put forward as kind of aligning with federal standards, but it's really rolling back protections.
Right.
And so, for example, this bill, what it originally did is it said we have this very broad, or at least we had, a very broad definition of what waters of the Commonwealth means. And that term is helpful in our state laws about what how we can monitor pollution and how we can regulate pollution into waterways. So we had a very broad definition. I think it included ponds, reservoirs, well, marsh, any surface or underground water. It was a very expansive definition. Federally, only water that can be protected is navigable waters. So, which is a very specific thing, a navigable waterway. And it makes sense federally, right? Because when you're talking about between states, right? What water goes between states? It's mostly navigable waterways, right? Or at least that is, an argument for this. There's lots of different conversations from the EPA about and arguments about what navigable means. But I digress. Talking about this bill specifically, what they wanted to do is limit also what Kentucky Environmental Protection Cabinet could do was look at navigable waterways. Now, that bill did change a little bit over the session, and essentially they changed it to include sinkholes, certain types of springs, and certain types of wellhead protection areas, which is kind of a broad term for a specific type of protected water that feeds into mostly public utility waterways. So. Right. The big concern, though, from advocates is that this new definition does not allow for protection of a lot of underground water, of a lot of groundwater and things that feed into private wells, because a lot of Kentuckians rely on private wells and not public utilities. So that was one of the big concerns about this bill, and it created a lot of conversation in both the Senate and the House. I know that there was a lot of environmental groups that were contacting lawmakers very aggressively about this change.
Yeah, because I know, and I don't know if this influences, but it sounds like it would. I know Louisville has pride in our world-class drinking water, so I'm assuming the legislative could affect that.
Yeah, there's a lot of pride in Louisville water.
Yes.
In Kentucky water in general. I mean, bourbon, obviously. The reason why people talk about bourbon so much is they talk about that Kentucky water that feeds into it. So that was definitely a topic of conversation on the floor. And now, at the end of the day, I do believe that Louisville water, so the public utility here in Louisville, said that they are neutral on the bill, that the changes protect. That the changes that happened towards the end of the day here did protect Louisville water, but there's still a lot of concern for those private wells, for the groundwater that is eventually going to all feed back into itself, right?
Right.
But yeah, so Louisville water is neutral at the end of the day.
We'll be back with more after the break. You're on track with Louisville Public Media. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and you're listening to On Track. We're checking in with Kentucky Public Radio's Capitol reporter Sylvia Goodman on this year's Kentucky legislative session. So, were there any standout bills that passed with strong bipartisan support?
Sure, yeah, there were a couple actually, and there's some interesting bills. I mean, some of those bills ended up getting rider language. Like we talked about House Bill 90 earlier, that added the abortion clarifications. But on that bill was also freestanding birthing centers, which is a long time semi-bipartisan. There are a few lawmakers that are kind of holdouts on that one. But overall, I would say that lawmakers generally support the freestanding birthing centers, which has been a long time issue here in Kentucky, whether or not, you could have a birthing center that's detached from a hospital. We also had a bill that would provide disaster relief. That passed the last day of session here, actually, but that expands, that takes already appropriated money and reapportions it so that the governor can use it to help people who are suffering from the eastern Kentucky flooding from I believe that was in mid-February that disaster happened. So there were a few bills that definitely had some bipartisan support. There were some bills that Democrats did manage to sponsor and get through this session. Senator Cassie Chambers Armstrong, a Democrat, sponsored a bill that would require more training for coaches around sexual abuse. And so that bill passed. So there's a few things that definitely had strong bipartisan support.
And I know we talked about this. There's a lot of vetoing going on, but we need to talk about that process just for those who are new to it, like myself. Can you walk us through how that veto process works in Kentucky? Like when it happens, what kind of authority the governor actually has during that period as well?
Sure. It is complicated because it changes from state to state. I mean, all of these things are so state specific because they're laid out in our state constitution. So essentially what happens is the lawmakers has to go through both chambers. There's a lot of structure to how it's supposed to go through those chambers. But once they push it through and it's gotten the agreement of both bodies, it goes to the governor's desk. And the governor has three options. He can either sign it, he can veto it, and he provides a little statement about why he decided to veto it that the lawmakers are supposed to consider. And then finally, he can also just decide not to sign it. And after a certain amount of time, it becomes law without his signature. And so what lawmakers do is they have these 30 days that they're allowed to meet. They break it up. So they take a 10-day break right towards the end in which they allow the governor to consider, because the governor has to have 10 days to consider the laws that they've passed. So he gets 10 days to decide whether or not he's going to sign a bill or veto it or let it become law without a signature. And then after those 10 days, they reconvene for 2 days and they consider those vetoes. And in Kentucky, the governor's power is pretty weak in this area. So it requires only a constitutional majority. That means that it's just a majority of each chamber's full body. So, right, it's not like the majority of whoever's there that day. It's the majority of the body as a whole. So it requires at least, in the House, for example, 51 members to override a veto. But in our current legislature, that's very easy for Republicans to get. So basically, if a bill passed in the first place, it probably has the votes to be overridden. So sometimes, not often, but every now and again, lawmakers will decide not to override a veto. So, that usually happens maybe with line item vetoes, right? The governor has the power on certain bills to cross out specific lines. So sometimes they'll decide to leave that in. Like if the governor says this had a flaw in it and I can't implement it, for example, they'll consider that and be like, okay, fine, we'll leave that one in. But by and large, they override almost every single veto he puts in since they gained power.
So at this point, are all the bills that passed essentially locked in, or at this point, Governor Beshear doesn't have any more power to take action if they've overridden it?
And once they're overridden, yes, exactly.
Okay.
He has no more power. It's delivered to the Secretary of State, who it's now enrolled. It's become law. And so now the governor's power is actually not totally ended, because if in those final 2 days, the lawmakers are no longer allowed to come back. The session is ended. It's called sine die. They are without days after this point. And yes, sine die is the correct pronunciation. Don't come after me, Latin heads. But
That's hilarious.
But anyway, sine die is how it's pronounced. And after that, they cannot come back. So the governor still has 10 days, though, because they passed several bills on that last day. Like I mentioned disaster relief, right?
Right.
That is something they passed on the last day. So in those last 2 days, by and large, the only thing they'll pass is bipartisan stuff.
Right.
They'll pass stuff they're pretty confident Beshear won't veto. That's the general rule. Sometimes that's not what happened. They might pass things and maybe Beshear will veto it or something like that. But for example, like disaster relief, Beshear signed that right away. That's already become law because obviously Governor Beshear would like to provide disaster relief. That's a clearly bipartisan issue. So, that's usually what ends up passing in those last 2 days. So he still has a few bills on his desk, I believe, which he could decide not to veto or to sign or, whatever, or what have you. But by and large, the job of the legislature is done and his veto powers are mostly exhausted at this point.
Right. And any of those vetoes that have happened, did they stay or they were overturned? That you're aware of?
Every single one was overridden.
Okay.
Unless he decides to veto anything from those last couple days, which I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I would expect the governor to veto. That's not to say he won't. But by and large, every single veto was overridden except for 2 line items that I know of. And they were, so they were relatively minor line items.
Okay. So how soon do some of these new laws go into effect, and are there any with some immediate impact?
Yes, there are several bills that will actually go into effect right away. That's the vast majority of bills under the Constitution go into effect 90 days after the end of the legislative session. So that would put it, I think, at the end of June this year. But that being said, lawmakers have the ability to put emergency clauses on their bills. And so they put that on several bills this year. I think there's somewhere around 30-ish that they did that to. And so some of those will go into effect right away. So, for example, one of the bills we just talked about, the bill that would overturn Beshear's executive order on conversion therapy, that goes into effect right away. But they only actually put that emergency clause on part of the bill. So the part that has the Medicaid for gender-affirming care ban, that will go into effect in 90 days, but the conversion therapy element will go into effect immediately. So it gets complicated. It's tricky. You got to really read the fine print on these. But yes, there is a way, and several of these bills are going into effect and already are in effect.
Are there any other ones that I know it's like 30 bills, not a million. I'm exaggerating. But 30 bills. Are there a couple others that you think we should know about that are going into effect right away?
Yes. For example, another bill that we haven't talked about, it's kind of a weird one, which is why I didn't bring it up, but House Bill 241 goes into effect right away. And that is a bill that has 2 parts. It's another one that was another bill was smushed into it at the last minute. But it would create more flexibility for school districts, especially those that were in disaster areas, to add non-traditional school days or NTI days, because the legislature has a very strict cap on those. They don't want kids to be in non-traditional NTI days very frequently, but they're loosening that and allowing more discretion for disaster-stricken areas. So that bill, it has an emergency clause on it. Another bill was smushed into that had to do with a very controversial virtual school district. It's the Cloverport Virtual Academy. That would protect that school district to some extent. They've come into some issues with the Kentucky Department of Education. And so that was a very controversial element of that same bill. But that also goes into effect right away, those kind of protections for that school district, giving it some more leeway in the face of the Department of Education's concerns.
It sounds like with 30 days, you're trying to get it done, smushing them all together. So how can citizens engage with their representatives to express support support or opposition to these legislative measures?
So I don't want to say it's too late, but it's for this session, it's a little bit too late because these bills have all gone into effect. And like I said, they're legally, by the Constitution, limited. They cannot come back unless the governor calls a special session. Now, you can still contact your lawmakers and tell them whether or not you supported the things that they've already done, but they cannot come back and fix them until next year.
Okay, well then I'm just looking ahead then. If what issues do you expect to be on the table when lawmakers return next year, or is it still kind of too early to tell?
It's probably too early to tell. I always make guesses, and then I'm 90% of the time I'm wrong. I mean, I guess the anti-DEI bill, that one was pretty obvious that they would take that one up. But it's not 100% clear to me what we will see next year. If I had to guess, it's not impossible that we will see some reaction to federal changes. I think that could be a pretty big part of the next legislative session. We also might see another tax cut come up next year. They did some fiddling with the tax cut structure. So we have these triggers in place, and they fiddled with that so they can do these little incremental changes. So even if we wouldn't have hit the 0.5% cut trigger, we could hit next year, I believe, a half of that. So 0.25% tax cut trigger. So, they've been doing some fiddling with that this year, too. I didn't mention that earlier. But we could see some of that next year. Next year's the budget session. So We're definitely going to see some budget stuff come up. So those are a few of the things that I could expect seeing. And really, we'll just have to stay tuned to what they're talking about in the interim.
And then before I let you go, if you had one big takeaway from this year's legislative session, what would it be?
My big takeaway right now is there's a lot of frustration boiling up among constituents, and mostly with the federal level, but they really want their state lawmakers to take action too. So that's something I'm really going to be watching in the next year. It's how is that frustration? How are lawmakers going to be responding to it? And then also, like I mentioned, with federal changes on the horizon, they've already started hitting Kentucky. They're already starting to touch Kentucky. How are lawmakers going to address them? How are they going to be responding?
Thank you, Sylvia, so much for being here again on Track.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as always.
Sylvia Goodman is Kentucky Public Radio's Capitol reporter. Since 2023, she's been covering state politics and government, bringing Kentuckians the latest from the State House. On Track is a production of Louisville Public Media. The On Track production team includes Michelle Tyreen Johnson, Jacob Munoz, Alex Biscardi, and Laura Ellis. Our music is by Kojin Tachiro. If you're just tuning in and you want to hear the full show, you can find it now at LouisvilleOnTrack.org or in your favorite podcast app. And let's continue the conversation. Is there something you want to hear about, something that matters to your Kentuckiana experience? Let us know by sending us a text or giving us a call at 502-814-TALK or send an email to ontrack@lpm.org. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and being kind is free. That's the start of community. Until next time, you're on Track with Louisville Public Media.